not paying on time, trashing the house, having pets tear up everything. All of these are things that make a bad tenant, but in today's video, I'm going to talk about what makes a good tenant and how do you find them. For those that don't know me, my name's Jamie York and I've been involved in property investment now for the better part of a decade, and I created this YouTube channel just under a year ago to add as much free value to you so that you don't have to make the mistakes that I've made. So this is going to be a bit of a different video where I want to quick fire all the way through because I've got 15 points to get through that I think make a good tenant, and I want to do it quickly. So grab your pen and paper, ready to go in 3, 2, 1, go. First thing we need to decide is what actually makes a good tenant to you. Now this will be really different, but what I want you to think about is not what I hear all the time, I want them to be a working professional. Do you? Because actually in my experience, some of the best tenants I've ever had is LHA. For those that don't know what LHA is, it used to be called DSS. LHA is a local housing allowance, i.e. they claim some benefits either for all of the rent or partial payment. And actually they've been some of the best tenants turning my house into their home. But that doesn't mean it's the right thing. You need to decide what makes a great tenant to you. So if it is an LHA tenant, a local housing allowance, you need to accept certain things. So obviously you're not going to be able to check the last 3 months earnings from their job. You have to accept that either they're going to get paid first or you're going to need to put in a request to pay you directly. And it's really important to understand this, that actually there are additional loopholes to jump through in order to have an LHA tenant, and there are slightly more risks, so you need to put in more time getting to know them. But this doesn't mean you shouldn't take on LHA tenant. What I usually find is that when there's additional hoops to jump through, it acts as a barrier to entry and pushes away a lot of people. So if you're able to go in there, it adds more value to them. And if they're a working individual that's going to become a tenant, you want to look at affordability. For me, what I'm looking at is what their yearly salary is, and the way that I'm doing that is I'm times it by 30. So for example, if my monthly rent is going to be £1,000, I would not rent to them if they're not earning £30,000 a year or more, just as a basic affordability. What I'm also going to look at is, do they have any pre-existing CCJs, court county judgments? Quick tip on that, that would not deter me from a tenant if they were transparent about it, and also it depends on what the CCJ is for. So I didn't get a CCJ, but I did get a mark against my credit when I was 18 for a non-paid phone bill. Okay, and there was an explanation around that. Imagine that stopped me doing anything for 6 years. It's ridiculous. So I want to make sure they're looking into that. The other thing I'm going to be looking at is what rent did they pay before? Okay, even if they can afford it and they're earning $30,000 a year, but the last rent that they've been paying for the last 2 years, whilst they've been earning 30 grand a year, is £500. A majority of people have spending habits that relate to their current situation. So even though they're earning more than enough, because they're used to spending more money and their habits are there, does it translate to this? So it's not saying I wouldn't rent, but what I'd like to see is their money in their account being used for something, because if they're spending every penny out each month and waiting at the end of the month to get the rest of that money in, and they've been spending £500 a month, now it's going to be £1,000, that's going to cause some issues. Finally, what if they're self-employed? Well, what I like to look for is a T12. A T12 is a trailing 12. What this means is the last 12 months of their earnings, okay? I think that's going to give you a suitable average. Now, if somebody has newly started up a business, depending on where I'm at in my portfolio, my gut instinct, I might not rent to that individual just because it feels like too much risk to take on with somebody else, knowing that they're starting that new venture there, okay? If they're starting as a side gig and they're fully employed, then fine. But that 12-month journey, what it's going to show is consistency. Because you can have the last 3 payments making £5 a month, but what if they haven't earned a penny for the 9 months before that? You're going to end up screwing yourself over, and they won't be able to manage their money effectively. And by the way, this isn't just about protecting you, it's about protecting the tenant as well. Next is background checks. So there's 2 key background checks that a lot of people don't actually do. Number 1 is the credit check. Obviously, jump on Experian, ClearScore, whatever it is. I really like Experian for this. I think it gives a really a good overall picture of them. Again, if they've got unpaid payments or any CCJs, it won't switch me off completely, but I'll definitely spend more time looking into it. The other thing is previous landlords, especially if they're moving from one area to another. I'd always get on the phone to the previous landlord. And by the way, really good tip on this is whatever property address they give you as their prior location, they give you a contact number. Do a land reg search on the property. That's going to tell you who actually owns the property, so they don't give their mate Trevor's number, which they will, to give them a glowing recommendation. Make sure you're talking directly to the landlord. Next is right to rent. It is a legal requirement in the UK. It's also why I like using letting agents to manage my properties, because there's a lot of compliance around this. One of the big things you need to do is make sure you are doing the checks and getting ID. Remember, it's your responsibility to see original documents, ID, passport, driving license, whatever it is. Do not accept any photocopies. You need to make sure they are legally regulated and they are legally allowed to have the right to rent in the UK. It's going to protect you both, but ultimately good luck getting rid of the tenant if they don't pay you and you haven't done those right to rent checks. Next is a deposit or deposit protection insurance. Take out deposit protection insurance. I would have been absolutely fine with deposit protection insurance before the last 12 months happened, but a lot of them have not been paying out through people doing damages or loss of rent and things like that, and they're no longer taking new instructions. So for me, I want to see 6 weeks worth of deposit being able to be paid and deposited in a deposit protection scheme up front. In some areas it's now 4 weeks, and this changes and it probably will come down. But if somebody is struggling to pay that, that's probably not somebody I want to take a risk on, because anyone that is good with their financial management should be able to either come up with that money or have that money in their bank account ready to put down the deposit. If they don't have that, the absolute worst case scenario is I would want a guarantor. Now, the important thing that most people don't do as a guarantor is, number one, I'm going to do credit checks on them as individuals, what people don't do for some reason, which I think is nuts. And I also want to find out how much they're earning. And for me, I'd be looking at around 50 times the rent. Now, a lot of people are like, what, 50 times? You're charging £1,000 a month and you want them to be earning 50 grand? Yes, I do, because actually I assume the guarantor also is renting / paying a mortgage on their own place. And so I want to make sure that they're able to have the affordability of theirs and this property if push comes to shove. Here's a big one: communication and social media. Communication, how are they communicating? How do they turn up? Do they turn up on time? Do they call you to confirm an appointment? Do they pick up when you call them? How do they communicate over the phone? Are they turning up all scruffy and rough, or are they looking after themselves? All of these shouldn't be a black and white answer, but should play some part in you. Also, check their social media profiles. Again, if you're a tenant, maybe set it to private. But seriously, check them out. Now, what I mean by this is if you go on their social media and every single picture they're having house parties or doing that sort of thing, it's definitely something to take account of. And a really big one, if you don't want any pets at all, is go through their social media, because tenants, believe it or not, may tell a porky pie every now and then and go, no, I don't have a dog. And they've got 3 Rottweilers that are coming to tear the shit out of your door frames. Next is finding out how long they're actually looking to stay there. Now, for me, I'm very clear on my strategy is to make my house into their home. So if it's just a young lad that's looking to go there for a few months, maybe 6 months, a year, or there's a new father with a missus and a kid, or whatever the situation is, that's looking to stay here for a duration, or maybe I've got a property near a school and their kid's about to start in year 4 and want to stay there for at least a few years whilst they're going through that, that is definitely going to be my tenant type. Now, this is more relevant to the buy-to-let demographic rather than service accommodation or HMOs, but definitely something I want to know is what's their intent behind moving into my property, because ultimately I don't want to see it as a halfway house. I want to make this their home. Now, I mentioned pets earlier about checking social media, but should you allow pets? It's completely down to you. Now, I think there's a difference between having a Rottweiler dog, Alsatian, Husky, or whatever it is, and a small little, I don't know, Labradoodle that's not really going to do too much damage to your property. Maybe a Cavapoo. Why are these random dogs coming into my head? Who knows? But what I will say to you is, remember, more barriers to entry, the more demand there is. Now, I know I was brought up with dogs, and I know tenants really struggle to find a half decent property anywhere with a pet. Now, if you can provide a great home, maybe take a more substantial deposit for that, even increase the rent. And we've done that. Somebody's offered over 150 above market value to have a small dog and a cat in the property, and they've been there for years. Now, they will stay there for a long time. And a big part of that is, one, they're going to struggle a lot to find another property that will allow us. And if you know any dog people or cat people, it's like children. It's like part of the family. It's not a normal thing, emotion towards an animal, right? So it's part of the family, which means that that home really is becoming their home. And if you can get over that and reduce the barrier of entry to them, it can be very rewarding. Next is don't rush. Now, I get it. You've spent a long time building up this money. You've invested. The refurb's gone over budget and over time. You thought it'd be much quicker and easier than this. And now you just want to get a bloody tenant in because you can't be paying the utilities, the council tax and the mortgage any longer. Well, I can tell you what would hurt you more is getting the wrong tenant that moves in, screws up your property, trashes it, and doesn't pay you. Be patient. Don't rush this exercise. Do your due diligence, find the right person, and your house will become their home for a long time, and you'll be getting that true passive income on a monthly basis, hopefully for decades to come. Next is knowing the demographic before you actually buy. And the research starts before you actually acquire a property. A lot of people end up over refurbing a property for the tenant type or under refurbing the property for the tenant type. If you understand the types of tenants in the area, do the socio-demographic breakdown. I really like using property data if you want to spend a monthly amount. It's very accurate. If not, I really like using Street Check. Okay, they update if they're not updated it for a while, but it's a very good indication of who's in the area, what sort of jobs they have in the area, and the breakdown of all of the demographic in the area. And it gives you a lot of information to go off. So you already know what type of tenant you're pretty much guaranteeing what type of tenant's going to be applying for your property. And the more information you have up front, the more informed your decisions are. The final big one that I want to wrap up with is follow your gut. People talk about gut instinct as if it's not really a big deal. It is, okay? Your gut is often telling you something for a reason. And if you're serious about moving forward with this as being a proper passive income, sometimes you need to follow your gut instinct, okay? This is a big investment. This is a big commitment that you're making to the tenant, to the customer, to the client, and you want to be making sure that you're facilitating the right one. So follow the steps that I've just been through above and follow your gut instincts. And of course, every single one of you should be subscribing, hitting that notification bell, and if you've got 2 seconds before we finish up, lightly tap that like button before we move on. See you in the next video.